Good evening, everybody. My name is Ann Thompson, and I'm the Assistant Director for Public Services here at the Essex Library. I'm exceedingly pleased to welcome you to another episode in the 13th year of the Centerbrook Architects Lecture Series. Tonight's special because we get to welcome back architectural historian Ted Sawruk to our stage. Just a few housekeeping guidelines as you all get settled into the room. If you will please keep your microphones muted. I've got your cameras turned off as a setting, but don't play with that if you don't mind. We are expecting a large crowd tonight, so we'll save our bandwidth and give it all to Ted as much as we can. If you think of questions as Ted is going through his talk, please put them into the chat and we will get to all of them after the presentation. I also encourage you to use the chat if you can to let us know where you're located, especially if you're in another Connecticut town or even if you're from out of state. Many of you know that the Connecticut State Library asks us to keep track of the numbers of people who come to our program. So I've launched a poll. It would be wonderful and kind of you if you let me know how many people are viewing with you tonight, viewing your one screen. So if you could just put those numbers into the poll, then I can put my number into the State Library and everybody's happy on July 1st. If you prefer, you can always send me an email with the number of people you're viewing with tonight too, if that's better for you instead. Just one note, our next Centerbrook lecture will be on May 14th at 7 o'clock as well. As we have been promising, art and architectural historian Chuck Benson will be coming back to give a talk entitled Great Iconic American Residential Architecture of the 20th Century. He'll be talking about Richard Neutra, Frank Lloyd Wright and others in that ilk. There'll be pictures of houses from Palm Springs all over the United States and in the 20th century. So it should be a fantastic talk on May 14th. That information's already up on our website, so you're welcome to go register for that whenever it's convenient for you. And with that, looks like people have pretty much put their numbers into the poll, so I'm gonna pull that down. And I'm gonna turn the podium over to Centerbrook Principal Jim Childress.
Thanks, Darla. I get to introduce Ted. First, I'd like to thank Mike Crosby for introducing us to Ted. Many of you have asked us to bring more historians on, and we've gotten some great people to come in, like Chuck Benson, who's coming in May. But Ted is a real find. He lectured on Afghanistan last time. He's got one on, I think, Italianate architecture in Connecticut. Tonight, he's going to talk about the history of residential architecture in Connecticut from 1600 to 2000. I'm getting to know Ted. I think he's a real Connecticut treasure. I'm grateful you're here. He's a full-time associate professor at the University of Hartford, teaching in the graduate program. He got his bachelor's degree at Carnegie Mellon and has a graduate degree from the AA, Architecture Speak, and ArchiSpeak, the Architectural Association in London. He's been on the faculty at Hampton University, Southern Polytechnic University, University of Arkansas, and Drury College before coming here. And as a number of the faculty at the University of Hartford, one of their specialties is working in other countries. Ted is leading up, putting together an architecture school in Herat, Afghanistan. So he wears many hats. Ted, thrilled you're here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jim. I'd like to start off by thanking Centerbrook for their support of the lecture series and recognize, the many patrons of the library who attend these different lectures and support the interest in architecture. As Jim mentioned, my first lecture dealt with the development of postmodern architecture in Afghanistan. And the presentation was maybe a little bit more academic. This go around, this is a topic that was requested by some of the local patrons. They were interested in what are some of the styles of architecture here in Connecticut. So this time, I thought it would be a good idea to maybe, as we would say, freestyle and give you less dense content. One of the things that we realize these days is that any one of you can easily Google one of these styles and find an entire list of all of the characteristics. one of the things that might be missing is actually some of the reasons of why and how the different styles came about and whether or not they became popular here in Connecticut. So with that, I'd like to sort of launch us off. Oh, I guess it's, there we go. So we have to go back a little bit further than Connecticut and look at the Mayflower and the first English settlers that came to North America in 1620. And the reason that we do this is because it's important to realize that when New England was first settled and the English colonists arrived, they thought they were actually going to Virginia, which has a much different climate than Connecticut. When they landed in Massachusetts, they were not prepared for the harsh winters and the hot summers that they confronted. And certainly during the first year, a good number of the pilgrims passed away. What we see is that when they first arrived, they naturally built structures that they were familiar with. This is what is referred to as a cot or a cottage from England. It's a one-room structure, usually with a single door, possibly one or two windows, and a fireplace. There may be a loft area built above the main space. This would usually be for children to sleep in the evening. This was a typical medieval structure that could be found anywhere in England. And when they first arrived, they thought that they would sort of reproduce these prototypes. However, these structures were not really suited for the climate that we faced. However, there's very few of these that remain. One or two of them exist. This is a lovely drafting that's been done that documents the size. I don't know how many of us could actually live in a house that's only 14 feet by 25. Here's a reconstructed version that we could look at today. Now, it's important to realize that during this period in time, various settlers started to arrive from England and they started to move around the country. However, the first settlers that came to Connecticut were actually the Dutch that came from New York and came up the river in Connecticut and arrived in the Hartford area. Now, Connecticut was one of three major colonies that were being developed. Originally, the Plymouth colony, the Rhode Island colony, the Connecticut colony, and then eventually the Massachusetts Bay colony. Shortly after the Dutch arrived, English settlers started to move into the area. I'm gonna sort of flake on this. I forget the name of the individual who's noted for bringing the colonists here originally, but they did settle in Hartford, Windsor, and New Haven. And so what we start to see is that the real development of Connecticut really functions along the Connecticut River. And this becomes a really important aspect, not only of the types of buildings that exist, but why development exists. Now, the first structures are a group of structures called cellar houses. This was something that the pioneers learned from the Native Americans. They modified it using, of course, English traditional construction techniques. It was very simply done by taking a hillside, digging out an area, chopping down some trees, and organizing those posts along the outer edge of the wall, berming up the sides of that with dirt, creating a shed roof, and then covering that with plant material. Usually there was only one wall that was exposed, and if it was done correctly, this was oriented south and had a door to enter and exit, and a window that allowed for ventilation and light. And here you can see some reconstructions on the right and some sketches from 1836 while they were still being used in Milford Point, Connecticut. It's important to realize that early American architecture was actually a combination of not only English traditions, but the lessons learned by indigenous native tribes. And these two elements come together to create colonial architecture. A fun fact is that there are only two authentic American styles. One is the colonial style, and then the second one is the Depression modern style of the 1930s. Almost every other style was inherited or brought over from England, France, or Spain. Now we're going to look at a sort of survey of architecture here. I'm hoping that if I can't at least enlighten you with facts, I can razzle dazzle you with images. And during the colonial period, we're going to go 1600 to 1800. There were, in my opinion, three primary attitudes. The first was survival, and early colonial architecture in Connecticut was about survival. After we managed to survive came civility and the decision to create urban centers and bring a sense of class and status to architecture. And finally, in the years after the Revolutionary War, Connecticut architecture began to strive for a kind of independence. The different styles we'll look at are the English garrison, the colonial salt box, the Georgian style, and the federal style. Now, we start with the typical garrison style houses that were popular in the Elizabethan period in Tudor England. You can see on the left here in Shropshire and in Birmingham, the typical wattle and daub, post and beam construction. Now, it's important to also realize that when the settlers came up the Connecticut River, they were primarily looking to be farmers, but very soon discovered that with the rocky landscape, that it was not necessarily suitable for farming. This led to the development of an entire industry along the Connecticut River focusing on shipbuilding. And at one period in time, almost 90% of all ocean-going vessels that functioned in the United States were actually constructed along the Connecticut River. So what we see here is that the river becomes not only the main transportation and the main focal point of life in Connecticut, but this tradition of shipbuilding carries over eventually into the craft of the houses that we see. Another thing that we want to be aware of is what was life in England like, and how did this possibly influence the architecture that we saw? Now, in coming over, they brought with them the idea of the medieval hall, the parlor, and the kitchen. And if you look at the lower plan, what was typical during the Middle Ages was to have a large two-story hall where everyone in the manor would gather at the end of the day to enjoy the night meal. On the dais would sit the Lord and his family, and in the larger part of the hall is where the rest of the staff and servants would reside. They would eat, and then afterwards push the tables to the side, and as you can see in this engraving of Haddon Hall up above, merriment would ensue. To make life very interesting, off to the left, we see the kitchen and service areas. And through the screen wall that you can see in the upper image, food would be brought in a very ceremonial manner. Up in the loft area, musicians would often play music to accompany this parade of food. This was a way of sort of celebrating the end of the day. Certainly during high holidays, this was a huge event. As the frivolity, ensued, you can see that things could easily get out of hand. And so the next element here was the withdrawing room, what we would call today the parlor. And certainly when the lord and lady and other women and sort of younger children decided that things were getting a little bit ruckus, they would retreat to the parlor. So the parlor, in a sense, becomes a quiet space, a place for reading, socializing, maybe some entertaining, some card playing, some game playing, these things. It's definitely a retreat. So let's talk about the Garrison. As we mentioned, that these early colonialists built architectural styles that mimicked England. And in this early version, we see a timber post and beams. Oh, why is it going forward? We see a timber post and beam construction. We see the Garrison overhang, some small leaded windows, the steep roof, and in the plan, the hall and the parlor. While they couldn't adopt the scale of the medieval manor house, early English settlers did adopt this hall and parlor structure. And the hall, in this sense, was where the kitchen and food were prepared and where guests were originally brought in and entertained. The parlor became a withdrawing area, an area to go for quiet, more sociable interactions. And again, the upstairs is divided between two upper rooms, usually the husband and wife, and their younger children would sleep in one room, and the older children would sleep in another room. While this is a construction technique, it's not only about style, it's also about function. And we'll talk about that in a minute. The prototype that we want to look at then is the Garrison evolves into the salt box. If you look at the plan of the Hollister house here, we can see that in the front portion, it's the typical Garrison with hall and parlor. However, a single story or lean-to has been added to the back, which serves as the new kitchen. Also, there's two side rooms. One of these might be a pantry. The other is usually a first floor bedroom for older relatives who can't necessarily navigate the stairs as easily. With this arrangement, Americans actually achieved in some way the medieval manor house, where food could be prepared in the kitchen and then brought into the hall to be enjoyed, and then after dinner, retreat to the parlor. The second thing, though, is that everything about the salt box is generally about surviving in this new climate. The front of the house was always oriented south. The overhangs allowed for shading of the windows in the summer. They allowed for the lower sun angle to penetrate into the house in the winter. As a matter of fact, I was discussing this with some students the other day. You may look at a leaded glass window and realize that the edges of the glass are beveled. And in this case, this is not, again, necessarily a decorative feature. By beveling the edge of the individual panes, it allows the sunlight to magnify and add additional heat into the room. Oftentimes, the saltbox house also had interior shutters, so you could close off or adjust the amount of light that was coming into the room. Also, by having the steep northern roof, it deflected winter winds away from the house. And finally, if you allowed for a basement, then you would maintain a temperature in and around 60 degrees. So in the harshest of winter climates, you could actually take the family and retreat, if you want to call it, to a panic space down in the basement and remain warm enough that you would not freeze. So everything about this house is actually put together as a way of actually surviving in the climate. And the reason then it became a prototype that was shared all around New England. And here are some different examples from, again, Andover, Farmington, and Wethersfield. As we move, this is a nice image from the early 1800s of the Connecticut River, and you can really start to see the development along the river and the various towns and villages that began to spring up. After Americans managed to survive, they then looked at civility. And this is Asher Benjamin. He is a local Connecticut-born architect. He studied with Bulfinch in Massachusetts, and he wrote a number of pattern books. He later died in Springfield, Massachusetts. These pattern books provided builders throughout Connecticut with not only plans, but details of Georgian architecture. Now, Georgian architecture differs from early colonial architecture in the sense that it brought, if you want to call it, Renaissance symmetry and proportion. While earlier colonial houses could be asymmetrical with a larger hall and a smaller parlor or a variety of different additions added to the side, the Georgian house required a completely symmetrical facade. It also was based on architecture that was popular in England during the reign of King George I through King George III. And although those architectural styles were initially represented in masonry, either brick or stone, Americans translated that style into a wooden architecture. If we're looking at the left here, the salt box was now replaced with a somewhat Palladian plan, with a central hallway and a central stair, a library and a parlor, and then usually a bedchamber and a dining room. The kitchen in many cases was either moved to the basement or into a subsidiary space added onto the house, or even potentially as a separate building behind in case of fire. One of the things that the Georgian house had, other than double hung windows, a use of ornamentation in and around the roof, was the central doorway. Now, very quickly here in the Matthew Sad house, notice that to gentrify the structure, the second generation has tried to convert their salt box into a Georgian style house by adding this elegant door surround. As we move forward, the Georgian style became extremely popular with successful merchants. These were individuals and ship captains. These were individuals who were moving around the colonies. They were in New Haven, potentially Boston, Providence, Philadelphia. They had connection with people who were traveling from Europe to the United States, and they became aware of these styles. Again, while we take this for granted, the fact that these were very elegantly proportioned and symmetrical facades was a major achievement for Americans. Also, you can begin to see not only were the doorways elaborately fenestrated, but over the windows, we began to see, again, classical elements. Here we see little pedimented or potentially even rounded window fenestration. I really love these extremely ornate doorways. They're pretty exciting and exuberant. One thing that I do want to point out is the Belden house is actually correct. It was very popular in Georgian architecture to paint the house entirely one color. The white trim on the colored background is actually a revival style that was made popular later on. So it's not actually correct, but I'll sort of let that go. Now, things change a little bit when we have the American Revolution. Obviously, those individuals who engaged in the Georgian style wanted to show that they had the same status and civility of their English counterparts. But when we broke from the mother country, it became important for Americans to establish their own independence, their own style. And so the Georgian house transformed into the federal style house. Now, these transformations are rather subtle, but a couple of things will really jump out. First is that the dentil molding under the, I don't know why it just did that. Go back, thank you. The dentil molding under the roof became more elaborate. The central window over the doorway was often a Palladian window, as we see here. However, it could also be an oval window, an arched window, or any type of uniquely designed window. While the Georgian house has a very flat doorway fenestration, the federal style introduced the three-dimensional porch. And here we can see that it's kind of brought out. Also, the elements tended to mimic stone. So if you're looking there at the window surrounds, the tops of the windows have lintels that suggest a kind of keystone. Well, I'll show you a house in a minute that also has corner edges that show stone work made out of wood. So here we can look at this, and it was easy to take a Georgian house and, in this sense, make it a federal style house. You could add a three-dimensional porch to the front of your Georgian house. You could embellish your window surround. You could even potentially add elaborate dentil molding to your roof underhang. The Champion House in East Haddam, which was built specifically for a war hero and one-time Connecticut senator, is an absolutely amazing federal style house. Not only does it have all of the characteristics that we mentioned, but it has these corner stone representation entirely made out of wood. So you can see here that they're really trying to emulate a stone house, even though it's made entirely of wood. However, eventually we get to the true federal style. In urban centers, the federal style was entirely made out of red brick, having black shutters and a three-dimensional porch. This was popular in Philadelphia and Boston. Eventually, it emigrated to New Haven, and the Ingersoll House. Ingersoll had been elected mayor of New Haven and celebrated by building this new, very fashionable house. Once that was established, the red brick style began to move throughout Connecticut, and the Timothy Green house, built by a retiring ship captain, emulates the Ingersoll house. However, you can see up above in the Levitt house in Haddam, this beautiful, again, Palladian window, the oval window in the gable, and then an extremely elaborate colonnaded entry. As we began to move into the early 1800s, Connecticut saw a real expansion in prosperity. Shipbuilding and commerce had produced a level of wealth that was not necessarily seen during the colonial period. Simultaneously, they became aware of the concept of democracy and how that was playing out in the new country. And finally, the picturesque came into play. So we'll see the arrival of the Greek Revival, its counterpart in the Gothic Revival, and it being challenged by the Italianate. This is a lovely picture of Hartford from in and around the early 1880s. And you can see that it's very much a thriving kind of mercantile center. Now, Thomas Jefferson was a major proponent of classicism, but before he passed away, he also espoused the Greek Revival movement. He saw it very much as a symbol of the new democracy. And as Americans began to create their own new persona, we identified with the Greeks and the Athenian movement, and we tried to aspire to emulate democratic values. This was also promoted by, again, another series of pattern books. Millard Lefebvre published an extremely popular builder's guide. And what's very interesting to me is it first makes its way to New Haven. And if you trace back the Greek Revival houses as they begin to appear, they are more or less moving up the Connecticut River as this builder's guide is being transferred from carpenter to carpenter and eventually adopted by locals within the area. At one point in time, Philadelphia had so many Greek Revival buildings that it was referred to as the Athens of the New World. Being frugal, conservative, and innovative, many Connecticut residents adopted the Greek Revival and simply transformed their Georgian style houses to now Greek Revival houses. If you look at the image at the bottom of the slide, we have a Georgian Revival house, which now a classical Greek pediment and columned porch is added to the front. This became extremely popular. If you wanted to go one step further, you could add wooden columns made out of clapboard or flatboard to the corners of your house, or even go as far as to add these flat columns entirely around the house. Newer homes that were being constructed turned the flat side of the house around and put the gable side towards the street. And this enabled new builders to create the temple facade that really emulated the Greek Revival style. Now, this style was further promoted by Ethioltown. Ethioltown is a Connecticut native son. It is, of course, no small realization that he studied under Asher Benjamin, and he evolved Asher Benjamin's Georgian style into the Greek Revival style. Two buildings here. This is Ethioltown's own house that was built in New Haven. It was later purchased and transformed into an Italianate style residence, which is somewhat unfortunate that we lost the original Greek Revival version. But the old State House in New Haven was designed by Ethioltown. One of the things that really promoted the Greek Revival in Connecticut was James Hillhouse. He had an ambition to transform New Haven into one of the nation's most beautiful cities. To that end, he developed Hillhouse Avenue, which was going to be, for lack of a better term, sort of, the Beverly Hills of Connecticut. He established very large lots and more or less oversaw the stylistic development of the street. All of the houses on the street were to be designed in the Greek Revival style and have a certain amount of status and dynamic frontage. These are three of the houses that remain from that street that you can see here. Ethioltown himself matriculated up to Middletown, where new homes that were being built around High Street with the establishment of Wesleyan College allowed him to build first the Samuel Russell House, a true Greek Revival temple facade, then the Elizabeth Apthorpe House, which, although it has iron railings today, very much mimicked Ethioltown's own home in New Haven. And finally, for Russell's brother, Edward, this more modest Greek Revival. And finally, some different prototypes along the Connecticut River. The Dickerson House in Essex, the Shaler House in Tylerville, and the Gladwin House also in East Haddam. As Connecticut progressed into the 1940s, another individual had a major impact on architectural styles. Andrew Jackson Downey presented an entire treatise on cottage residences. One of the things that happened in the 1840s, was the fact that many wealthy individuals in New York, Providence, Boston, and New Haven saw the Connecticut River as an ideal retreat. And along the Connecticut River, many summer cottages started to appear. There were two primary styles. One is the Gothic Revival style. The second is the Italianate style. And you can see here, Andrew Jackson Downing did not have a preference. He published both versions in his book of cottage residences. Now, the Gothic Revival came to the United States, again from England, when there was a revival in England of an architectural style that espoused to represent what was truly English. The French had more or less adopted the Baroque and had evolved that into French Baroque, first under Louis XIV and then Louis XV, and then eventually after the Revolution with Napoleon. And the English wanted an identity that was entirely separate from Catholicism. And they hearkened back to the Gothic. This becomes eventually the age where we see Pugin and Ruskin and the Gothic Revival, specifically in things like the Houses of Parliament. The Gothic Revival mostly has its impact on religious architecture, particularly Episcopalian and other religions that were derived from England. However, it became a kind of romantic or alternative to the Greek Revival. And here in the Lockwood Matthews Mansion in Norwalk, we see this style which is exuberant, asymmetrical, dynamic, and in some ways, what do you want to say, fantastic. I happen to notice that it comes at a time that is very similar. It follows Lindenhurst, which was being redesigned by Andrew Jackson Davis between 64 and 65, and may have had an impact on Lockwood when he decided to build this house. However, throughout the different towns along the Connecticut River, we see the Carpenter Gothic cottage. This becomes a wonderful retreat from the heat and smog and dirt of the inner city. Many families came to Connecticut for 3, 4, 5 months during the summer months and built these various cottages. As I mentioned to someone else, you can get them in almost any color you would like. However, challenging the Gothic Revival is the Italianate, borrowed from Renaissance models. The Italianate provided a slightly more elegant and classical reference. Initially, it's symmetrical. It engaged in heavy brackets, arched fenestration, and wraparound porches. However, it could also be modified into something much more picturesque by placing a central tower. You could have an L-shaped plan, a corner tower, or any projection off the side. It also engaged in this idea of an American summer, with usually having extensive porches that provided opportunities for socialization and outside activities. As such, one could rest and relax under the shade of the porch during the afternoon and retreat inside later on in the evening. During summers, the full-length floor-to-ceiling windows, often functioning as doors themselves, could be opened up, allowing the breeze to flow through the house. So these really do become these artifacts that enable a kind of recreational lifestyle to develop in Connecticut. As we enter the Victorian period, the post-Civil War provides prosperity, democracy, and the picturesque. Here, the Second Empire, the stick style, the shingle style, and the Queen Anne style come into play. As Americans began to travel more often, they found themselves in Paris of the Second Empire. Napoleon II was rebuilding Paris, and the mansard roof was now the style of the boulevards and avenues of this major city. Americans brought this style back and saw the style as a way of showing status, culture, and more or less an international flavor. However, Connecticut builders, being sort of ingenious, oftentimes took an Italianate plan and basic Italianate details and added the mansard roof to the form. So we sort of get this interesting hybrid that exists between the two of them. However, there are a number of buildings that are truly Second Empire in their inspiration. One of the things that is also interesting here, though, is the Second Empire is influenced by the emerging Queen Anne style, which has a real love of color and particularly contrasting or numerous colors. So while the Second Empire style in Paris is a little bit more reserved, the wooden counterparts in Connecticut are much more vivacious and exciting. And here you can see the brilliant colors, creams, greens, reds, purples, lavenders added to these buildings. Simultaneously, architects became more eclectic. As American architects not only traveled to Europe and brought back influences, their patrons did as well. And the vernacular styles of Europe, particularly in Switzerland, Russia, and Germany, influenced architectural styles in the United States. And the East Lake or stick style, which was made popular in Newport, Rhode Island, began to emigrate not only in and around the suburbs of New York City, but also to Connecticut. And certainly Samuel Clemens, wanting to be on the cutting edge of style, embraced the East Lake style. And here we can see the variety of brickwork, the various use of stick members, the almost eclectic use of vernacular styles as far as balconies and railings. And this is certainly a more is better approach to architecture. And while there are not a lot of these homes in Connecticut, there are a few that remain and certainly can hold their own against any building that was built at the time in Newport, Rhode Island. Here, the Lewis Cottage or the Moody House have all the elements of a stick style residence. Another style that was being developed in Newport, Rhode Island by the architects McKim, Mead, and White was fueled in some way by the 1876 anniversary of the Revolutionary War. It's a very interesting thing because as this anniversary comes about, there's suddenly an interest, once again, in colonial or colonial revival architecture. And while it may be hard for us to see this as such, the shingle style saw itself literally as a version of colonial revival architecture. And what it did was take the sort of large structures which were being developed at the time and melded them with farm structures. So certainly the gabled barn, the oat or mill tower, and then various vernacular elements would be combined together. Add to that a layer of Tuscan columns, some, again, shutters that would sort of be inoperable, but become a part of actually the fabric of the wall, was really all a part of this reviving of colonial architecture. Now, one of the key things here is that in a shingle style house, usually it's all one color. Oftentimes, originally the shingles were allowed to just age and turn a dark brown or black, and they were highlighted with this evergreen color. And this is very much the typical original shingle style. We can see a few traces of that. The cottages in Fenwick are all in the original, allowed to age shingle color with the green trim. However, there are many variations, and we can see throughout Hartford and other locations these shingle style houses. Entirely, the shingle style allowed, or the construction of shingle exteriors allowed for curved forms, undulating forms, various angled forms, which typical clapboard construction found very hard to realize. And finally, the Queen Anne. Often referred to as painted ladies, these architectural styles engaged in a combination of materials. They wanted towers, wraparound porches, bay windows, balconies, and really celebrated the craftsmanship of the 1880s. One would combine stonework, brickwork, and intricately carved woodwork, all in a celebration of craft. We have a variety of these throughout Connecticut. There's a number of wooden versions, which are referred to as generally Queen Anne, and what's often referred to when turned into masonry as Romanesque Revival or Renaissance Revival. However, the real joy here is a celebration of craft and materiality. Finally, when we move to the 20th century, we're confronted with nostalgia, innovation, and finally fashion. We have historic revival styles, colonial revival, the international style, and postmodern architecture. Now, obviously, one of the most well-known eclectic historic revival styles is Gillette Castle. The turn of the century saw real wealth coming to Connecticut. And with that, particularly obviously in Greenwich and other areas, some very large mansions. And here we'll just give you a plethora of styles. However, the United States and particularly Connecticut was celebrating in the revival of historical styles. Obviously, you can see the Tudor revival, the shingle style revival, the Renaissance or Romanesque revival, the Cotswolds revival, and the classical revival. However, by the 1930s, the United States was confronted by two aspects. On one hand, the modern. Innovation, industrialization was really sort of pressuring life to move forward into the modern. However, historical styles had promoted a nostalgia in the United States and also in Connecticut. So the modern was confronted with the Cape Cod. And the classical revival and the modern challenged each other in the same way that the Gothic revival and the Italianate had challenged each other a century before. Certainly, though, in Connecticut, the classical revival won out, and I show you the Rabbit Hill below, which is sort of massive federal style revival house in Westport. The international style was brought to Connecticut by Philip Johnson and other architects, for the most part, I would say, associated in some way with Yale University. And the town of New Canaan is considered to be one of the United States' most significant collection of mid-century modern houses. Obviously, the flagship of this is the Glass House by Philip Johnson from 1949. However, Connecticut is home to some really outstanding works by very famous international style architects. You know, homes by Richard Neutra, Ulrich Franzen, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Marcel Breuer all reside within the state. The international style in the post-war period was trying to establish the United States as a world leader, having more or less won World War II. We tried to turn our back in some ways on the classical styles that had been promoted by the Axis powers. This really gave the modernism of the international movement its boost up. However, for some reason, Americans have always been very shy to accept modern architecture, and particularly international style architecture. But Connecticut was sort of a haven for a period of time in the 1950s and 60s. As we move forward, I've listed here the Chick Everett House, I'm sorry, the Chick Austin House as postmodern, even though it was constructed in 1930. And it's my contention that this may possibly be really the first postmodern house in the United States. You know, Chick Austin aspired to have a monumental classical home of status with some limited resources. He constructed out of wood a Palladian fantasy by framing it in a garden setting, almost as if it was a stage set. He was able to rival other architectural revival styles of the 1930s. However, the house itself is more a symbol or a sign. It's only 18 inches wide and only one room wide as they align one after the other. So this raises some questions, but certainly is worth considering. Connecticut then became the home of many postmodern architects, building on the international style. Architects like Richard Meyer, Robert Venturi, Peter Eiselman, and Robert Stern all had the opportunity to construct different versions of this new movement in Connecticut. As we begin to wrap this up, there are some contemporary versions. Various architectural firms are building houses in Connecticut that not only engage in tradition, but also continue the architectural styles of Connecticut. I believe if you look at all four of these versions and think about some of the images that you saw previously, you'll be able to connect them to inspiration that was derived from previous architecture. with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us and looking at this, and I'm certainly open to taking questions.
Ted, that was amazing. I have more than a page full of notes, so thank you so much for an amazing explanation of 400 years of history and architectural styles in the United States, or mainly in Connecticut, and the wonderful explanations of why things were and became the way they did. I am so grateful to you. And we do have a bunch of questions. And I will steal the first one because I can, is, are there books that you would recommend that would flesh out the points that you've made this evening? I mean, if there are one or two that stick out in your head as sort of the go-to guides.
You know, these days, a couple of years ago, I probably would have said, oh, this field guide or that field guide as such. Today, so much is available online. I have to, I really do say that, because it's, it's very easy to go and type in something, hit video, and immediately go to YouTube and, get this. A series that I would recommend if anybody has access to it or is willing to look it up is Pride of Place, that Robert Stern put together maybe 25 years ago. It's a series, I think, of 6 videos that really talk about the evolution of architectural styles in the United States. And, you can kind of pop one of those on and have a meal or a beverage and sit back, and each one is about 45 minutes long. And I would recommend, starting there, kind of thing.
Are those the ones for PBS?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, we'll figure out a way to try to get access to those. Mm-hmm. So one question from the audience came through, were Greek Revival houses originally white?
Yes. And this was the dominant characteristic, although obviously in some way trying to create a temple entablature and colonnade of some kind was important. White was critically important. At the time, they thought that all classical architecture was white. And so you can see that it would be, while Georgian architecture was very colorful, you could transform your Georgian house into a Greek Revival house merely by, again, adding some ornamental details and painting it white, kind of thing. I find that, although some people do and don't see this, I always look at a lot of the modern architecture, let's say work by Richard Meyer, which has always been white, as an attempt to sort of create some kind of connection back to the Greek Revival movement.
Oh, interesting. So a question connected to that would be, at the time, was the social status of the house, or was there social status in the house, or the messaging of the design in any way a political message? So, for instance, would loyalists stick with Georgian style homes, whereas the rebels would go for a colonial?
I think initially, again, the Georgian style, which dominated most of the colonial period, the federal style was very short, almost only 10 years. But if you wanted to say neutral, you could just keep your Georgian house. If you wanted to make a statement that you were sort of really pro, the new independent colony, or, you could go ahead and, create a federal style house. By the time the Greek Revival comes about, it really is seen as a representation of democratic values. Now, one of the things that's interesting here is you'll notice that there's only maybe 1 or 2 representations of the grand temple facade in the Greek Revival here in Connecticut. They're much more modest interpretations of the style. Ironically, it's in the post-Civil War period when the really great plantation houses were built in the South, but they adopted the more Roman and imperial style for their residential architecture. And I don't think that you can fail to see a kind of modest engagement with democracy versus this sort of embracing of imperialism in the sort of slave colonies.
Yeah, makes sense. Another question was, if you were the person who built the first Greek Revival or Gothic Revival house, were you considered radical and provocative in Connecticut?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, you can imagine that once, you can see this, once the Greek Revival becomes popular, even if you're sort of living in your kind of Georgian converted, you know, Greek Revival house, and someone shows up from Boston or New York City and builds a Gothic Revival cottage, and it's lavender or blue or pink, you know, right down the street from you and all of your friends who have white houses. This would be sort of like, you know, having Frank Gehry show up and build, you know, a deconstructivist house right down the street from your Cape Cod. So while I thought it was very interesting, I'm going to just mention this, which was funny. Once I had a conversation with a historian in East Haddam, and we were talking, the students did a design project, and they proposed some modern buildings. And one of the locals was like, oh, we can't have that. And we said, well, why not? Well, East Haddam is a historic area. You know, we have historic structures. I said, yes, we did an analysis. There are 12 different styles of houses or buildings in East Haddam, each one a completely different historic style. So why would you stop adding to that list of new styles? And they didn't see it that way. There was only like historic and new. And new was not good. But, you know, I would argue every one of those new styles challenged the status quo.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and so to that exact point, the question comes through is, are we still importing? So, you know, the Norwegian modern wooden houses, for instance, are still influencing or coming through and influencing residential architecture in Connecticut. Are we still bringing something new in?
Now, one of the things that I would point out to everyone here, and I didn't go into it too much, but the Connecticut salt box is literally one of the most sustainable structures by its plan, its distribution. Is sort of the chimney as a heat sink, the shading, all of these, you know, I think there's 11 or 12 different sustainable aspects to that house as it evolved over time. And the reality is, as we move forward, if somebody really wanted to build a net zero off the grid house, you would start with a salt box prototype. If you add to that, you know, heavy insulation, some solar, passive solar or active solar gain, a geothermal system, you could probably literally have an entire neighborhood of net zero houses.
Oh, that's very true. Yeah, and what a great insight, which ties into the very next question, which from Stephanie, who says, moving forward, how do you see an energy efficient and sustainable house being designed? So I think you may have answered that, but go ahead and fill it up.
Well, this is one of the things that's going to be really interesting. You know, we have this conversation with students, and I said, you want to be careful that sustainability doesn't become a decorative style. You know, if you imagine a split level suburban house and somebody starts slapping windmills and solar panels and all these kind of elements to the side of it, but maybe they don't really work as such. Whereas if we're looking back at some of the historic styles when they didn't have access to oil-based energy, the houses were designed for ventilation, for, to sort of compartmentalize. They were designed to use natural heat gain and natural cooling and these kind of things. So I'll throw this out as a minor advertisement. The next lecture that I'm going to give, which is actually going to be a little bit more academic, once again, deals with the Italianate Villa. And the Italianate Villa became actually a physical apparatus that helped create the American nuclear family. And our idea of a mother, father, and children, and sort of having this idyllic social life, is created hand in hand with the Italianate Villa, largely because it was a naturally ventilated house that provided for social interaction during hot summers.
Yeah, there you go.
So, I mean, we just have to, in some ways, what's really fun about history for me is you can learn so much moving forward. And we're fortunate enough to have some great examples here.
Perfect. Yeah, exactly. And so everybody look for that lecture to happen in June. I can't remember if we picked a date, but if we did, I can't remember it. So
I don't think we did yet, but yeah.
Friday in June. So look for that information. And Michael Crosby says, and this may get you into the 14th season of Centerbrook Architects Lectures. He says, we have seen many exterior images. What about the interiors of these styles? I think that's a whole other lecture in and of itself, at least one whole other lecture.
Well, and it was funny because, Anne, when we were talking about putting this lecture together, and I remember at the time you're saying, well, people want to sort of see some of the different styles. And I thought, how are we going to really do a survey? How do you cover 400 years in a really short amount of time? But yeah, I would love to, as we move forward over the next couple of years, pick a style as such and really go into the social and cultural aspects of how people lived in those spaces. I myself am less interested in the list of details of the characteristics and more interested in how either social values or political values promoted a style, or how those particular buildings actually forged the way people lived or interacted with each other.
Yes, me too. I agree wholly on that. And you heard it here first, folks. That sounds like a promise. So we'll get those into the calendar as well. If there are any other questions, that was all that was in the chat. I don't see anything else coming in. Ted, that's just an amazing sort of treat to kick off Friday evening and into the weekend. I can't thank you enough for all that information. I can't wait to go drive around Connecticut a little bit. One
of the things I wanted to say is, and I have to be fair with this. I did not try to marginalize or miss or single out or focus on any one town or region or whatever. But when you start to really delve into it, there's an amazing amount of really wonderful buildings. And fortunately, in the last couple of years, some of them are really being nicely restored. As I was doing research for this lecture, I could find images of buildings that were 15, 20 years old, and they looked rather shabby. And then I would find something that was more recent and go, wow, somebody really loves this building. They've really taken care to revitalize and preserve a building that's moving forward. So please, if nothing else, maybe you saw a building that you never knew existed and you're like, hey, let's take a drive on a nice summer afternoon and check this out.
Yeah, excellent. And I think one of the things that we've never done very much of here with the lecture series is talk about preservation. So that's a whole other subject area that we can mine for interest and edification and hopefully some entertainment too. So with that, thank you everybody for your very kind comments. We're enjoying it, if not more than you are, at least as much. And I thank you for giving us part of your Friday evening and the start of your weekend. And I wish you all a very happy weekend and good health, and hope to see you next time, at least on May 14th, if not before then. Ted, thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure, as always. Thank you everybody for joining us.
All right. Take care, everybody. Stay well.